The fire pit at the center of the stone courtyard roared into the night sky, and every eye in the kingdom of Veremore was fixed on one woman who refused to move. Lyra Ashworth stood frozen between two rows of warriors, her heart slamming against her ribs, as King Damian Cross reached out his hand toward her. The entire pack had gathered for his coronation, and now, in front of thousands, his wolf had chosen its mate. He was supposed to be untouchable. He was supposed to be alone forever, ruling without weakness. Instead, his eyes had locked onto hers the moment she walked through the gates, and something ancient inside him had roared to life. "Step forward," Damian said, his voice calm but commanding, cutting through the silence like a blade through water. He did not smile. Alpha Kings rarely did during a bonding ceremony, because the moment was sacred, heavy with centuries of tradition. But there was something else in his gaze, something raw and unguarded, as if he had been waiting his whole life for this exact second. Lyra's hands trembled at her sides. She could feel hundreds of stares pressing against her skin, waiting, expecting her to walk forward and accept the greatest honor a wolf could receive. Becoming the mate of the Alpha King meant power, protection, and a place in history. It also meant exposure. It meant every secret she had buried since childhood would eventually claw its way into the light, and that was something she could never allow. She took one step back instead of forward. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even the warriors flanking her shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to do with a moment that had never happened before in the history of their kingdom. No one rejected an Alpha King. No one dared. "I said step forward," Damian repeated, though this time his voice had lost its calm edge. Something darker moved beneath his words, something the crowd could feel more than hear. "I can't," Lyra said. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to keep her chin high. "I'm sorry, but I can't accept this." The fire crackled violently, as if it too sensed the tension breaking across the courtyard. Damian's jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, the golden color of his eyes flickered into a deep amber, the mark of his wolf rising just beneath the surface, fighting to break free. "Do you understand what you are doing?" he asked, stepping closer despite the murmurs rising around them. "You are rejecting a bond in front of the entire kingdom. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand exactly what it means," Lyra whispered. And she did. She understood it better than anyone standing in that courtyard, better than the council members whispering behind their hands, better than the warriors who did not know whether to protect their king or step aside for what tradition demanded. She turned and ran. It was not the graceful exit expected of a woman who had just refused a king. She pushed through the crowd, her boots slipping against the smooth stone path, her cloak catching against the shoulder of a startled guard. Shouts rose behind her, voices calling her name, calling for someone to stop her, but she did not look back. She could not look back. If she looked into Damian Cross's eyes one more time, she was afraid she would lose the strength to keep running. She reached the outer gates just as the moon broke fully free of the clouds, spilling silver light across the fields beyond the palace walls. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept moving, weaving through the trees at the forest's edge, until the sounds of the coronation faded into nothing but wind and her own ragged breathing. Only when she was certain no one had followed did she allow herself to stop, pressing her back against the trunk of an old oak tree, sliding down until she sat among its roots. Her whole body trembled, not from the cold, but from what she had just done. She had rejected the Alpha King. She had shattered a bond that, according to every story she had ever heard, could not be broken without consequence. But she had no choice, not after what she knew, not after what had happened to her mother. Lyra closed her eyes and let the memory rise, the one she had spent years trying to bury. She remembered being small, hiding behind a wooden fence as soldiers from the old court dragged her mother through the village square. She remembered the whispered word that followed her family ever since: cursed, marked, dangerous. She remembered the silence that fell over their home the night her mother never came back. If the kingdom discovered what ran through her blood, what she had inherited, without ever asking for it, they would not simply call her cursed. They would end her, the same way they had ended her mother. And if she bonded with the Alpha King, if she tied her life to his, the truth would not stay hidden for long. Every secret unraveled eventually. She would not let her mother's fate become the reason Damian Cross lost everything he had built. Better to be hated as the woman who humiliated the king than loved as the reason his kingdom turned against him. She stayed hidden in the forest until dawn, her thoughts a storm of fear and grief. When the first light broke through the canopy, she finally rose, brushing dirt from her cloak, and made her way toward the small healer's cottage on the outskirts of her home village, the only place that had ever felt safe. Her Aunt Ivy was waiting at the door before she even reached the path, worry etched deep into her face. "You did something," Ivy said, not as a question. News in Veremore traveled faster than wind through open fields, and clearly word of the rejection had already reached them. "Tell me you did not do what I think you did." "I had no choice," Lyra said quietly, stepping past her into the small, familiar warmth of the cottage. Ivy closed the door behind them, her expression torn between fear and something close to pride. "Do you know what they will say about you now? Do you know what the council will do?" "I know exactly what they will say," Lyra replied, sitting heavily at the wooden table, where she had grown up learning the names of healing herbs instead of playing with other children. "They will call me a fool. They will call me ungrateful. Maybe worse." "And the king?" Ivy asked carefully. "What will he do?" Lyra did not answer right away. She thought of the look on Damien Cross's face in the moment before she fled, the confusion beneath his anger, the flicker of something that looked almost like hurt. He did not know her. He could not possibly understand why she had done what she did. All he knew was that a stranger had rejected him in front of his entire kingdom on the night he was meant to be celebrated as its strongest leader in generations. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "But I know I cannot let him find out what I am." Ivy sat across from her, folding her hands together. "Your mother tried to hide it too. It found her anyway." The words settled over Lyra like a heavy blanket, cold and suffocating. She knew Ivy was not trying to frighten her. She was simply telling the truth, the same truth Lyra had carried with her since she was a child watching soldiers march her mother away. Some things could not stay buried forever, no matter how deep the hole. That night, Lyra lay awake in her small bed, listening to the wind rattle against the shutters, replaying the moment on the ceremony grounds again and again. She kept seeing Damien's eyes, the exact shade of amber gold, the way his expression had shifted from certainty to disbelief in the span of a single breath. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that whatever pull she had felt toward him, standing at that fire pit, had only been the bond forcing itself onto her, a trick of instinct rather than something real. But if that were true, why could she still feel the echo of it now, faint and aching, like a string pulled too tight and suddenly cut? Miles away, in the towering stone halls of the royal palace, Damien Cross stood alone on his balcony, staring out over the dark fields where Lyra had vanished. His warriors had returned empty-handed, unable to track her scent past the tree line, which was strange in itself, since no ordinary wolf could vanish so completely from a trained search party. His council had already gathered behind him, voices low and urgent, debating what her rejection meant for his rule. Some called it an insult that demanded punishment. Others feared it was an omen, a sign that his reign was already cursed before it truly began. Damien said nothing to any of them. He simply stared at the horizon, one hand pressed against his chest, where a strange, unfamiliar ache had settled the moment she ran. He had led armies. He had faced down rival packs without flinching. But nothing had prepared him for the hollow feeling spreading through him now, as if some vital piece of himself had been ripped away before he even had the chance to hold it. "Your Majesty," said Elder Marcus, the oldest member of his council, stepping closer with visible caution. "The girl must be found. A broken bond left unresolved can grow dangerous, for her and for you." "I am aware of the danger, Marcus," Damien said quietly, not turning around. "Then you understand we must act quickly." Damien finally turned, and even in the dim moonlight, his exhaustion was plain to see. "I understand that she ran from me the moment she saw me. I understand that whatever reason she had, it was strong enough to make her defy tradition, defy the entire kingdom, and disappear into the night, rather than stand beside me. That is not something solved by force, Marcus." The old man studied him for a long moment. "Then how do you intend to solve it?" Damien looked back toward the dark fields, toward the direction she had fled. "I intend to find out who she is," he said, "and why she was so afraid." Far away, Curled beneath a thin blanket in the healer's cottage, Lyra finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that the king she had rejected was already making a quiet, unshakable decision. He would not force her to return. He would not punish her for what she had done. He would simply find her, and he would not stop until he understood the truth she was so desperate to hide. Neither of them knew yet how deeply their fates were already tangled together, threads pulled tight by something far older and far more powerful than either of them fully understood. And neither of them knew that the coming weeks would test not only the bond between them, but everything Lyra had spent her whole life trying to protect. For now, the fire at the coronation grounds had burned down to embers, the crowd had scattered into worried whispers, and two hearts, one crowned and one hidden, beat with the same unanswered question echoing through the dark. What happens now? 3 weeks after the coronation, Damian Cross collapsed in the middle of a council meeting, and no healer in the palace could explain why. One moment he was standing at the head of the long stone table, arguing with a border patrol captain about increased movement near the eastern woods. The next moment his knees buckled, his hand shot out to catch the table's edge, and pain tore through his chest like claws raking beneath his skin. Guards rushed to his side. Elder Marcus shouted for the royal healer. Damian waved them all away, forcing himself upright through sheer stubbornness, though sweat had broken out across his forehead and his breathing came ragged and uneven. "I am fine," he said through clenched teeth, though everyone in the room could see that he was not. It was the third time this had happened in a week. Later that night, alone in his chambers, Damian sat by the window, with a cup of untouched tea cooling beside him, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass. He looked older than he had a month ago. Shadows had settled beneath his eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. His wolf, usually a steady, powerful presence beneath his skin, now felt distant and weak, as if something had cut the connection between them, and left only a thin, fraying thread. He knew what was happening, even if he refused to say it aloud. A broken bond did not simply fade quietly into memory. It festered. It pulled at the both of them, slow and merciless, weakening the wolf's connection to its own strength, until either the bond was completed, or both wolves suffered the consequences. He needed to find her, not out of anger anymore, not out of wounded pride. He needed to find her, because if this continued, it would kill them both, and something told him she did not even understand what was happening to her, wherever she had hidden herself. Meanwhile, deep in the small healer's cottage on the edge of her home village, Lyra was fighting her own battle in silence. It started as small things. A dropped bowl she should never have dropped, her hands trembling for no reason at all. Then came the dizziness, sudden waves that hit her without warning, forcing her to grip the nearest table or wall to keep from falling. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself it was stress from the ceremony, from running, from living every day afraid that soldiers might appear at her door demanding answers about what she had done. But deep down, in the quiet places of her mind she tried hardest not to visit, she knew it was something else. "You look worse than you did last week," Ivy said one morning, setting a cup of herbal tea in front of her with a look of open concern. "You are not sleeping. You barely eat. Lyra, tell me what is happening to you." Lyra wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, grateful for something solid to hold on to. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like something inside me is unraveling, slowly, and I can't stop it." Ivy's expression grew serious. She had lived long enough, had seen enough of the old stories, to understand exactly what Lyra was describing, even if Lyra herself refused to name it. "It's the bond," Ivy said quietly. "Rejected bonds do not simply disappear, child. They linger, they pull. If it is not resolved, it will keep draining you both until there is nothing left."
"Both?"
Lyra repeated, her stomach twisting.
"Both,"
Ivy confirmed.
"Whatever you are feeling, the king is feeling as well."
"Perhaps worse, since he carries the full weight of his position along with it." Lyra set the cup down with a shaking hand, guilt curling through her chest, despite everything she had told herself about protecting him. She had run to save him from a future where her secret destroyed everything he had built. She had not considered that the very act of running might slowly destroy him regardless. Word arrived 2 days later, carried by a nervous young messenger who nearly dropped his scroll twice before managing to hand it to Ivy at the cottage door. The Council of Veremore had issued a formal decree. Every healer in the region was to be gathered and questioned about unusual magic, unexplained illness, and any wolves showing signs of a broken or unstable bond. It was framed as concern for the kingdom's well-being, but Lyra understood immediately what it truly meant. They were looking for her. "You cannot stay here," Ivy said, the moment she finished reading the scroll, her voice tight with fear. "If they come searching cottage to cottage, they will find you. And if they discover what you carry in your blood, alongside a broken bond with the king himself, there will be no mercy for either of us." Lyra's mind raced, panic and exhaustion tangling together until she could barely think straight. Running again seemed impossible when her body already felt like it was failing her. Staying seemed even more dangerous. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to force clarity into the chaos. "What if I go to him?" she said suddenly, the words surprising even herself. Ivy stared at her. "Go to the palace? Lyra, that is the last place you should." "Think about it," Lyra interrupted, sitting up straighter, despite the ache in her limbs. "If the council is searching every village for the source of the broken bond, it is only a matter of time before someone connects it to me regardless of where I hide. But if I go to him directly, under my own control, perhaps I can find a way to ease the pull between us, without ever confirming what I truly am. Healers assist wolves with bond complications all the time. If I present myself as simply that, a healer offering aid, perhaps no one will look deeper." "That is an enormous risk," Ivy warned. "Everything is a risk now," Lyra said quietly. "At least this way, I choose it instead of waiting for it to find me." The journey to the palace took 2 full days on foot, since Lyra dared not risk drawing attention by requesting a horse or a guide. She wrapped herself in a plain traveling cloak, kept her hood low, and rehearsed the story she planned to tell the palace guards 100 times in her mind. She was a traveling healer. She had heard rumors of the king's declining health. She wished to offer her skills, nothing more. It was, of course, only half a lie. Standing before the towering iron gates of the royal palace for the second time in her life, Lyra felt her resolve waver. The last time she stood in this place, she had run from it as fast as her legs could carry her. Now she was walking toward it willingly, straight into the heart of everything she feared. The guards at the gate eyed her with open suspicion when she gave her name, a different name than the one whispered through every corner of the kingdom after the coronation. She called herself simply a healer from the southern villages, and prayed the story would hold long enough to get her inside. It nearly did not. "Wait here," one guard said gruffly, disappearing through the gates while the other kept a wary eye on her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Lyra's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain the guard beside her could hear it. When the first guard finally returned, his expression had shifted from suspicion to something closer to alarm. "The king will see you," he said. Immediately, Lyra's breath caught. She had expected to be questioned by a steward, perhaps examined by the royal healers before ever coming close to Damian Cross himself. Instead, she was led directly through the palace halls, her footsteps echoing against polished stone, past curious servants who whispered behind their hands as she passed. She was brought to a private study rather than the grand throne room, and the moment the heavy wooden doors opened, she saw him. Damian stood near the window, one hand braced against the frame, and even from a distance she could see how much he had changed since the ceremony. His broad shoulders, once carried with effortless authority, now seemed weighed down by something invisible. His face, though still striking, held a tired hollowness that had not been there before. He turned as the doors opened, and the moment his eyes found hers, something shifted in the air between them, a pull so strong it nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. She saw it hit him too, his whole body going rigid, his hand tightening against the window frame. "You," he said quietly, disbelief coloring his voice. "Your Majesty," Lyra said, forcing her voice steady, even as her pulse roared in her ears. "I heard you were unwell. I came to help, as a healer." For a long moment, he said nothing at all, simply studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and made it impossible to do so at the same time. "A healer," he repeated slowly, "who vanished the night I offered her everything, and now appears the moment rumors spread of my declining health. Do you take me for a fool?" Lyra's cheeks warmed, despite the seriousness of the moment. "I did not come to insult your intelligence, Your Majesty. I came because I understand what a broken bond does to both parties involved. and I believe I may be able to help ease the effects, even if I cannot undo what has already been done. Damien crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood only a few feet away from her. This close, she could feel the pull between them intensify, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace crackling nearby. "Why did you run?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of the anger that had colored it moments before. "I deserve to know that much, at least." Lyra's throat tightened. She had prepared herself for questions about healing remedies, about bond theory, about anything except the one question she least wanted to answer. "I had my reasons," she said carefully. "Reasons I am not free to share." "Not free," Damien repeated, studying her with narrowed eyes. "That is an interesting choice of words." "Your Majesty." "Damien," he interrupted, "if you are going to stand in my study, uninvited, yet somehow exactly where I need you to be, you may as well use my name." Something about the simple request unsettled her more than his earlier anger had. She nodded once, unable to trust her voice. Over the following hour, Lyra examined him as any healer would, though every touch, every moment of proximity, sent that same electric pull humming beneath her skin. She noted the faint tremor in his hands, the uneven rhythm of his breathing, the pale, strained color beneath his usually vibrant complexion. It was worse than she expected, far worse. "The bond is destabilizing faster than it should," she murmured, more to herself than to him, as she pressed gentle fingers against his wrist to check his pulse. "This should have taken months to reach this stage, not weeks." "Perhaps," Damien said, watching her closely. "The bond is stronger than either of us expected." Lyra did not answer. She could not without giving away far more than she intended. By the end of the examination, Elder Marcus had summoned the council to discuss what should be done, and it was decided, over Lyra's quiet objections, that she would remain at the palace under the official title of Royal Healer, tasked with monitoring the king's condition until a permanent solution could be found. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to run again, the way she had run before. But looking at Damien across the study, watching the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, she understood that running had never truly solved anything. It had only bought time that was now rapidly running out for both of them. That night, alone in the small chamber assigned to her within the palace walls, Lyra sat by the window and stared out at the same dark fields she had fled across weeks earlier. She thought of her mother, of the promise she had made to herself never to let anyone close enough to see the truth of what she carried. And yet here she was, closer to the King of Veremore than she had ever intended to be, feeling the pull of a bond she could not deny, growing stronger with every passing hour. She did not know yet how much more complicated everything was about to become, or how close the truth she guarded so carefully was to finally breaking free into the light. A scream echoed through the palace gardens just before dawn, and Lyra was on her feet and running before she even realized she had left her bed. She reached the courtyard to find two guards wrestling a struggling figure to the ground, a young kitchen servant who had apparently collapsed into fits of shaking and crying out in her sleep, her eyes rolled back, her body twisting against the cold stone path. Other servants stood in a frightened circle, unsure how to help, whispering about curses and bad omens under their breath. "Move aside," Lyra said sharply, pushing through the crowd with the same authority she used treating villagers back home. She knelt beside the girl, pressing gentle fingers against her temple, murmuring words to keep her calm, while she assessed what was happening. It took only a moment to recognize the signs, a fever dream twisted into something far more physical, likely brought on by exhaustion and the unusually cold nights that had settled over the palace grounds recently. By the time the girl's breathing steadied and color returned to her cheeks, a small crowd had gathered, including, Lyra realized with a jolt, Damien himself, standing at the edge of the courtyard in a loosely tied robe, his hair disheveled from sleep, watching her work with an expression she could not quite read. "She will be fine," Lyra told the anxious group of servants, helping the girl sit upright. Rest, warm broth, and no work for at least 2 days. Her body simply pushed itself past its limit. The servants murmured gratitude, several bowing awkwardly in her direction, before helping their shaken companion back toward the servants' quarters. Slowly, the courtyard emptied, until only Lyra and Damien remained beneath the fading stars. "You handled that well," Damien said quietly, stepping closer. It was nothing serious, Lyra replied, brushing dust from her knees as she stood. Exhaustion, mostly. Fear does strange things to the body when it goes unaddressed too long. Something flickered across Damien's face at her words, though he said nothing about it directly. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, the early morning light beginning to soften the sharp shadows across his features. "You care for people easily," he said. "Strangers, servants, anyone who needs help. And yet you fled from me the moment I offered you a place beside me." Lyra's chest tightened. "That is different, and you know it." "Do I?" Damien asked, tilting his head slightly. "Because from where I stand, it looks very much like a woman who gives everything to everyone except herself, and refuses the one thing that might actually be good for her." "You don't know what would be good for me," Lyra said, sharper than she intended, though the words carried more truth than she wanted to admit even to herself. Damien did not push further, though the look in his eyes told her the conversation was far from finished in his mind. Instead, he simply nodded once, and turned to walk back toward the palace, leaving her standing alone, in the fading darkness of the courtyard, her heart pounding for reasons she refused to name. Over the following days, a strange rhythm settled between them. Every morning, Lyra examined Damien's condition, tracking the subtle improvements that came with proximity, and the equally subtle setbacks that appeared whenever duties pulled them apart for too long. Every afternoon, she found herself pulled into palace life, in ways she had not expected, treating minor injuries among the guards, advising the kitchen staff on herbs for common illnesses, even teaching a young stable boy how to properly clean and wrap a wound after he cut his hand on a broken fence post. She told herself it meant nothing beyond her duty as a healer, but she noticed the way Damien's expression softened whenever he watched her work. She noticed the way conversations between them, meant to last only minutes, stretched into hours without either of them quite realizing how much time had passed. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her stay, she found him in the palace library long after most of the staff had retired for the night, a single candle burning low beside a stack of old books. "You should be resting," Lyra said from the doorway, though she made no move to leave. "I could say the same to you," Damien replied without looking up from the worn pages in front of him. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped closer, glancing at the book spread open before him. It was old, the leather binding cracked and faded, filled with handwritten notes about Bond theory and wolf history, far older than anything she had studied growing up. "What are you looking for?" she asked. Damien finally looked up, something guarded flickering behind his eyes. "Answers," he said simply, "about why this bond feels different from every story I have ever heard about rejected mates. About why, no matter how much distance grew between us these past weeks, I could still feel you, faintly, like an ache that never fully faded." Lyra's breath caught. She had felt it too, though she had told herself it was simply the natural pull of an incomplete bond, nothing more. "And what have you found?" she asked carefully. Damien's jaw tightened. Very little that makes sense. Except for one thing. He turned the book toward her, tapping a passage written in faded ink. Ancient texts describe certain bloodlines carrying magic beyond ordinary wolf abilities. Bloodlines connected to moon magic, capable of sensing danger, healing beyond natural limits, and forming bonds unusually strong, even before they are completed. Lyra's heart slammed against her ribs. She kept her expression carefully neutral, though every instinct screamed at her to leave the room immediately. "That sounds like an old legend," she said, forcing lightness into her voice that she did not feel. "Perhaps," Damien said, watching her closely, far too closely. "Or perhaps it explains why healers from certain families were once hunted, decades ago, under my father's rule. I never understood the reasoning behind it as a child. I assumed it was simple fear of outsiders. Now I wonder if there was something deeper my father chose never to explain to me." Lyra's hands curled into fists at her sides, hidden beneath the folds of her cloak. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. "Because I think you already know more about it than you are willing to say," Damien replied, his voice gentle despite the weight of his words. "And because whatever you are hiding, Lyra, I do not believe it makes you dangerous. I believe it makes you afraid, and I would like to understand why." The use of her real name, spoken so softly, nearly broke through every wall she had built around herself. She wanted, desperately, to tell him everything. To finally set down the burden she had carried alone since she was a child, hiding behind a wooden fence, watching soldiers drag her mother away. But fear held her tongue. Fear built from years of watching what happened to families like hers when the truth came to light. "I should go," she said instead, turning quickly toward the door. "Lyra." Damien's voice stopped her before she could take more than a few steps. She turned back reluctantly, finding him standing now, the old book forgotten on the table behind him. "Whatever it is, you do not have to carry it alone forever. I am not my father. I would never hunt someone for the blood running through their veins." "You say that now," Lyra whispered, "because you don't yet know what I truly am." Before he could respond, she slipped from the room, leaving him standing alone among the old books and dying candlelight, more certain than ever that the truth behind her fear was something far larger than either of them had yet uncovered. Sleep did not come easily that night. Lyra lay awake in her chamber, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, replaying every word Damien had spoken. He had come dangerously close to the truth without even realizing it, and the pull between them, the one she had spent weeks trying to convince herself was nothing more than magical instinct, felt stronger now than it ever had before. She thought of her mother again, of the gentle woman who used to hum old healing songs while grinding herbs at their kitchen table, who had taught her everything she knew about caring for others before soldiers arrived one terrible night and changed everything. Her mother had never explained the true nature of their magic, not fully, insisting it was safer for Lyra to know as little as possible until she was old enough to understand the danger that came with such knowledge. But Lyra was no longer a child hiding behind a fence. She was a grown woman standing in the middle of a kingdom that still feared the very thing running through her blood, standing closer than ever to a king who seemed determined to understand her rather than fear her. The following morning brought unexpected trouble. A messenger arrived at the palace gates just after sunrise, breathless and pale, carrying urgent news from the eastern border. Reports had surfaced of strange illness spreading among wolves in the outer villages, illness that mirrored, disturbingly, the same symptoms Damien had been experiencing since the coronation: fatigue, weakened connection to their wolves, unexplained collapses. The council gathered immediately, and Lyra was summoned alongside them, her position as royal healer granting her a place at the long stone table, despite several disapproving glances from older council members, who still viewed her with open suspicion. "This cannot be coincidence," Elder Marcus said grimly, spreading a map across the table marked with several small red circles, indicating the affected villages. "Whatever weakened the king's bond appears to be spreading, affecting wolves, who have no connection to him whatsoever." "Or," said a sharp voice from the far end of the table, "it is connected to something else entirely, something that arrived in this palace at nearly the same time these symptoms began appearing." Lyra's stomach dropped as every eye in the room turned toward her. The voice belonged to Victor Kane, a broad-shouldered council member with cold, calculating eyes, who had opposed Damien's coronation from the very beginning, favoring instead a distant cousin, with stronger ties to the old court. Lyra had noticed him watching her with quiet suspicion since her arrival, though she had not expected him to voice his doubts so openly, so soon. "That is a serious accusation," Damien said sharply, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. 1. I would advise you to support with evidence before repeating it in this room again. Victor's expression remained calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made his words more unsettling. "I mean no disrespect, Your Majesty. I simply find it curious that a healer with no verified history, no known family beyond a small village on the southern border, arrives at your palace at the exact moment your health begins to fail, and shortly after, illness spreads among wolves throughout the kingdom. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps it is not." The room fell into tense silence. Lyra kept her expression steady through sheer force of will, though her heart pounded so violently she was certain everyone at the table could hear it. "I came here to help," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm and even. "Not to cause harm." "Perhaps that is true," Victor replied smoothly. "Or perhaps it is simply what you wish us to believe." "Enough," Damien said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, for the first time since Lyra had arrived at the palace. "Lyra has done nothing but ease my condition since her arrival. If anything, her presence has helped, not harmed." I will not tolerate baseless accusations against her character. Victor inclined his head in a show of respect that did not quite reach his eyes. Of course, Your Majesty. I only wish to protect the kingdom, as always. The meeting continued, shifting toward discussion of sending healers to the affected villages, but Lyra barely absorbed any of it, her mind spinning with the realization that she was no longer simply hiding from her own fears. She was now, whether fairly or not, a suspect in the eyes of at least one powerful member of the king's council, someone who clearly wanted her gone from the palace, one way or another. When the meeting finally ended, Damien found her alone in the hallway outside the council chamber, her back pressed against the cool stone wall, her eyes closed as she tried to steady her breathing. Ignore him, Damien said gently, stepping closer. Victor has opposed nearly every decision I have made since taking the throne. This is nothing new. He is not entirely wrong to be suspicious, Lyra said quietly, opening her eyes to meet his. I did arrive at a strange time. I did run from you the night of the coronation. From his perspective, the pieces fit together in a way that looks troubling. The pieces only look troubling because you refuse to share the full picture, Damien said, though his tone held no anger, only quiet patience. I am not asking you to explain everything at once, Lyra. But I need you to trust that whatever this is, we are stronger facing it together than apart. Lyra studied him for a long moment, torn between the instinct to run, the same instinct that had carried her away from him weeks earlier, and a growing, undeniable desire to finally set down the weight she had carried alone for far too long. I'm not ready, she admitted softly, but I am trying to be. Something in Damien's expression softened at her words, understanding, rather than frustration, settling across his features. That is enough for now, he said. For now. Neither of them noticed the shadow retreating quietly around the corner of the hallway, nor the calculating look on Victor Kane's face as he disappeared back toward his own chambers, already forming plans of his own regarding the mysterious healer who had captured the king's full attention, and, quite possibly, threatened everything Victor had spent years working to achieve. Smoke curled from a small brazier in Victor Kane's private study, and the man himself sat hunched over a stack of old records, searching for anything that might confirm what he already suspected in his gut. Somewhere in the kingdom's history, buried beneath decades of carefully rewritten records, he was certain the name Ashworth would surface, tied to something far more dangerous than simple village healing. He was right. It took 3 days of careful searching through the palace archives, quiet conversations with older guards who remembered events long forgotten by younger generations, and one particularly useful bribe paid to a records keeper willing to overlook proper procedure. By the end of the 3rd day, Victor held in his hands a faded execution record from nearly 20 years earlier, bearing a name that made his lips curl into a satisfied smile. Elena Ashworth, executed under order of the previous king, charged with practicing forbidden moon magic, a bloodline deemed too dangerous to allow within the kingdom's borders. Victor did not go to the council immediately. He was patient, calculating, and understood that information held quietly carried far more power than information shouted from the rooftops. Instead, he requested a private audience with Damien, choosing his timing carefully, waiting until the king was alone in his study late one evening, away from Lyra's steadying presence. Your Majesty, Victor said, closing the study door behind him with deliberate care, I have found something you should see. Damien looked up from the papers on his desk, immediately wary of the barely concealed satisfaction in Victor's expression. What is it? Victor placed the faded execution record on the desk without a word, watching closely as Damien's eyes scanned the page, watching the exact moment recognition and horror settled across the king's features. This cannot be right, Damien said quietly, though something in his voice suggested he already understood the truth of what he was reading. I assure you, it is entirely accurate, Victor said. Elena Ashworth, executed for practicing forbidden magic, passed down through her bloodline. And unless I am mistaken, her daughter currently resides within these very palace walls, treating your health with unusual success that began, coincidentally, the very same week strange illness began spreading among wolves throughout the kingdom. You are suggesting Lyra caused this, Damien said, his voice hardening. I am suggesting, Victor said carefully, that you deserve to know the truth about the woman living in your palace, sharing your table, tending to your health, with hands that carry magic your own father once deemed too dangerous to allow within these borders. Damien said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the faded ink, his mind racing through every conversation he had shared with Lyra since her arrival, every moment of hesitation, every flash of fear he had seen behind her eyes whenever conversation drifted too close to questions of her past. It made sense now, in a way that settled heavily in his chest. Her reluctance to explain her rejection, her careful avoidance of any questions about her family or her childhood, her clear terror the moment he mentioned old texts describing bloodlines connected to moon magic. "Leave me," Damien said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Victor bowed slightly, satisfaction still lingering behind his calm expression, and left the study without another word, confident he had planted exactly the seed of doubt he intended. Damien sat alone for a long time after Victor departed, the execution record still spread across his desk, before finally rising and making his way toward Lyra's chambers, questions burning through him that he could no longer ignore. He found her awake, sitting by her window exactly as she had been the night she first arrived at the palace, staring out at the same dark fields that had once carried her away from him. She turned when he entered, and something in his expression must have told her immediately that everything had changed. "What happened?" she asked, rising quickly from her seat. Damien held up the faded record without a word, watching her face carefully as recognition dawned, followed swiftly by a wave of fear, so raw it nearly broke his resolve to demand answers. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, though it was not truly a question. "Is it true?" Damien asked instead, his voice tight with a mixture of confusion, hurt, and something closer to desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, there might be another explanation. Lyra's shoulders sagged, years of careful hiding finally collapsing under the weight of a truth she could no longer deny. "Yes," she said quietly. "Elena Ashworth was my mother." The confirmation settled heavily in the room between them. Damien set the record down slowly on a nearby table, running a hand through his hair as he tried to process everything at once. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said, though his tone held no accusation, only exhausted confusion. "Because I watched them drag her away when I was a child," Lyra said, her voice trembling, as years of buried grief finally broke free. "I watched soldiers march my mother through our village square, calling her cursed, calling her dangerous, simply for the blood running through her veins. I have spent my entire life hiding what I inherited from her, terrified that if anyone discovered the truth, I would suffer the exact same fate. I would never." "You don't know that," Lyra interrupted, tears finally spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. "Your own father ordered her execution, Damien. How could I possibly trust that his son would react any differently?" The accusation landed like a physical blow, and Damien flinched, though he understood, painfully, that her fear was not unreasonable, given everything she had survived. "I am not my father," he said quietly, though the words felt inadequate against the weight of her grief. "I wanted to believe that," Lyra said, wiping tears from her face with trembling hands. "That is why I came here, instead of running further away. But believing it and trusting it enough to risk everything are two very different things." Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile, until Damien finally crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands gently in his own. "Tell me everything," he said softly, "not because I demand it as your king, but because I want to understand, truly understand, what you have carried alone for so long." And so, for the first time since that terrible night so many years ago, Lyra finally spoke the whole truth aloud. She told him about her mother's gentle nature, about the healing songs she used to hum, about the night soldiers arrived with torches and cold expressions, dragging her mother away, while Lyra hid behind their garden fence, too frightened to make a sound. She told him about growing up under her aunt's careful guidance, learning to suppress every flicker of unusual ability, learning to appear as nothing more than an ordinary village healer, while secretly carrying visions and instincts that defied ordinary explanation. She told him about the night of the coronation, about the moment his wolf recognized her as his mate, and the immediate, overwhelming terror that had gripped her, not because she did not want him, but because she understood, better than anyone, exactly what discovery would cost him if the truth about her bloodline ever came to light. "I ran to protect you," she said finally, her voice raw with exhaustion. Not because I did not feel the pull between us, but because I felt it so strongly. I was terrified of what it would mean if the kingdom ever learned what I truly am. Damien listened to every word without interruption, his expression shifting from shock to something far softer, something closer to quiet devastation on her behalf. You carried this alone for so long, he said finally, believing that protecting me meant destroying yourself in the process. It felt like the only choice I had, Lyra admitted. It was never the only choice, Damien said firmly, lifting her chin gently so their eyes met. You are not your mother's tragedy, Lyra. You are not a curse waiting to happen. Whatever magic runs through your blood, it has done nothing but heal since the moment you arrived in this palace. That is not something to fear. That is something to protect. Your council will not see it that way, Lyra whispered. Victor already suspects me of causing the illness spreading through the villages. Damien's expression hardened at the mention of Victor's name, understanding immediately why the man had chosen this particular moment to reveal what he had discovered. Victor has wanted a reason to remove you from this palace since the moment you arrived, he said. This will not be the last attempt he makes. Then what do we do? Lyra asked, fear and exhaustion mingling in her voice. Damien rose slowly, pulling her up alongside him, his hands still holding hers, with a gentleness that steadied something deep within her chest. We stop hiding, he said simply. Together. Lyra searched his face for any trace of hesitation, any flicker of doubt that might suggest his words were spoken more from duty than conviction. She found none, only quiet, unwavering certainty. Are you certain? She asked softly. Once this becomes known, there is no undoing it. The council may turn against you. The kingdom may turn against both of us. I have spent weeks feeling half of myself slip away, unable to understand why, Damien said. I would rather stand beside the truth, whatever consequences follow, than continue living a lie that is slowly destroying us both. For the first time since the night of the coronation, Lyra allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that perhaps her fear had been misplaced from the very beginning. Perhaps the danger was never simply in being discovered. Perhaps the true danger had always been believing she had to face it entirely alone. Outside the palace walls, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place between the king and the healer he refused to abandon, illness continued spreading through the outer villages, and Victor Kane began quietly gathering allies among the council, convinced that whatever bond existed between Damien and Lyra Ashworth was not merely dangerous, but the perfect opportunity to finally seize the influence he had craved for years. The following morning would bring choices neither of them could avoid, choices that would determine not only their fate, but the fate of an entire kingdom standing on the edge of change it did not yet fully understand. By mid-morning, word had already spread through the palace that the council would be convening an emergency session, and Lyra could feel the weight of dozens of curious, suspicious stares following her every step through the corridors. Servants who had once greeted her warmly now offered only quick, uncertain glances before hurrying past. Whispers followed in her wake. Fragments of conversation about cursed bloodlines and forbidden magic, carried just loud enough for her to hear. Victor Kane had wasted no time. Overnight, the private knowledge he once held quietly had spread through enough trusted allies within the council that by the time Lyra and Damien entered the council chamber together, the tension in the room was nearly suffocating. Your Majesty, Elder Marcus said carefully, as they took their seats, his expression torn between loyalty to his king and genuine concern over what he had heard. Serious accusations have reached this council overnight. I trust you intend to address them directly. I do, Damien said, his voice carrying the steady authority of a king, fully in control, despite the storm gathering around him. Before this session continues, I want to be clear about one thing. Lyra Ashworth is not responsible for the illness spreading through our villages. She has done nothing since her arrival, except ease my condition and offer aid to anyone within these walls who required it. With respect, Your Majesty, Victor said smoothly, rising from his seat at the far end of the table. The timing remains deeply concerning. Her arrival, your declining health, the sudden spread of illness among wolves who have no connection to you whatsoever. And now we learn she is the daughter of a woman executed for practicing forbidden magic. Surely you understand why this council cannot simply dismiss such concerns. Murmurs of agreement rippled through several council members, and Lyra felt her stomach twist painfully, though she kept her expression as steady as she could manage under the weight of so many judging eyes. "The magic in my blood does not cause harm," Lyra said, rising to speak for herself, rather than allowing Damien to defend her alone. "It heals. It always has. My mother used her gifts to help every family in our village, for years, before her death, never once causing the kind of illness now spreading through the eastern territories." "And yet we have only your word for that," Victor replied, his tone maddeningly calm and reasonable despite the accusation buried within his words. "You have more than her word," Damien interjected sharply. "You have weeks of evidence within this very palace. Servants she has treated, guards she has healed. My own improved condition since her arrival, not worsened. If her magic caused harm, why would proximity to her ease my symptoms rather than intensify them?" Victor's confident expression flickered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "Perhaps her presence eases your condition, specifically because the bond between you demands it, while her true nature continues causing harm elsewhere, beyond the reach of your notice." "That is speculation," Damien said firmly, "not evidence." Before Victor could respond, the heavy chamber doors burst open, and a breathless messenger stumbled inside, his uniform dusty from hard travel, his face pale with urgency. "Your Majesty," the messenger gasped, bowing quickly. "Forgive the interruption. I bring urgent word from the eastern border villages." "Speak," Damien commanded. "The illness," the messenger said, struggling to catch his breath. "It has begun spreading beyond wolves entirely. Several human villages near the border have reported similar symptoms among their own people: fatigue, sudden collapse, confusion. And Your Majesty, the pattern of villages affected does not follow any path connected to the palace. It follows the old trade routes, leading toward the ruins of Hollow Vale." A tense silence fell across the chamber. Lyra glanced at Damien, noting the way his expression shifted from confusion to something closer to dawning realization. "Hollow Vale," Elder Marcus repeated slowly, his weathered face draining of color. "That location has been abandoned for decades, ever since the old court's experiments with forbidden magic were officially banned." "Experiments," Lyra repeated sharply, her healer's instincts suddenly sharpening with a different kind of alarm entirely. "What kind of experiments?" Elder Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing matters buried deep in the kingdom's past, but the urgency of the moment demanded honesty. Decades ago, before Elena Ashworth's execution, the old court attempted to harness moon magic artificially, believing they could create bonds and enhanced abilities without relying on natural bloodlines. The experiments were deemed too dangerous and officially shut down. Officially. "You believe someone continued the work in secret," Damien said, understanding dawning across his features. "I believe," Elder Marcus said carefully, "that whatever is causing this illness may have nothing to do with Lyra Ashworth at all, and everything to do with unfinished, unstable magic left buried beneath Hollow Vale, magic that may be reacting now to something happening within this very kingdom." Every eye in the room turned toward Lyra once more, though this time the weight behind the stairs had shifted from suspicion toward something closer to desperate hope. Could her presence be triggering something buried there? Elder Marcus asked slowly. Not through malice, but simply through the natural resonance of her bloodline, reacting with old, unstable magic left dormant for years? Lyra's mind raced, connecting pieces she had never considered before. If her mother's bloodline carried genuine moon magic, magic powerful enough to create a bond stronger and faster than anything recorded in old texts, it was entirely possible that her arrival within the kingdom, so close to wherever those old experiments remained buried, could indeed be reacting with dormant energy left behind. "I need to see Hollow Vale," she said suddenly. "Absolutely not," Damien said immediately, his protective instincts flaring sharply. "If dangerous magic remains active there, I will not allow you to walk directly into it. If I am the key to understanding what is happening, I may also be the key to stopping it," Lyra argued. "Villages are suffering, Damien. People, wolves, entire communities are collapsing from something none of us fully understand. If there is even a chance my bloodline can help identify or neutralize whatever is happening, I have to try." The council chamber erupted into heated debate, voices rising over one another as opinions split sharply between caution and urgency. Victor, notably, remained unusually quiet throughout the exchange, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more calculating as he watched the situation unfold in ways he clearly had not anticipated. Eventually, after nearly an hour of tense discussion, it was decided that a small, carefully selected group would travel to Hollow Vale, including Damien, Lyra, Elder Marcus, and a handful of trusted guards, while the remaining council members stayed behind to manage the growing crisis spreading through the villages. The journey to Hollow Vale took the better part of 2 days, winding through increasingly wild, overgrown terrain that had clearly been abandoned for decades. Ancient stone structures, half swallowed by twisting roots and creeping vines, rose eerily from the landscape as they approached, remnants of a place once dedicated to studying forbidden knowledge, now left to decay in silence. Lyra felt it the moment they crossed into the outer boundary of the ruins, a strange, prickling sensation crawling across her skin, similar to the pull of the bond but darker, heavier, tinged with something that felt distinctly wrong. "Do you feel that?" she asked quietly, glancing toward Damien, who nodded grimly, his own expression tight with discomfort. "Something is definitely active here," he confirmed, "stronger than I expected." They moved carefully through the crumbling structures, guards on high alert, until they reached what appeared to be the central chamber of the old research facility, a large circular room dominated by a massive stone circle, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing with dim, residual energy. "This is where the experiments took place," Elder Marcus said quietly, his voice tight with old memories he had clearly hoped never to revisit. The old court attempted to artificially recreate the bonding process, hoping to strengthen loyalty between wolves and the crown without relying on natural fate. They believed if they could harness moon magic directly, they could create bonds stronger than nature intended. "And it went wrong," Lyra said, studying the faded symbols carved into the stone. "Terribly wrong," Marcus confirmed. "Several wolves involved in the experiments lost their lives. The project was shut down immediately afterward, though clearly the magic used within this chamber was never fully neutralized." As Lyra stepped closer to the center of the stone circle, the pulsing energy intensified sharply, and a wave of dizziness crashed over her so suddenly she nearly stumbled. Damien caught her instantly, his arms steadying her before she could fall. "Lyra," he said urgently, "what is happening?" "It recognizes me," she gasped, gripping his arms tightly, as visions flooded her mind unbidden, fragments of the past, pushing into her awareness with overwhelming force. She saw wolves gathered within this very chamber decades ago, saw the desperate faces of those forced into unnatural bonding rituals, saw the exact moment something went catastrophically wrong, energy exploding outward, and burying itself deep within the earth beneath the ruins, dormant, but never fully extinguished. "It's not causing the illness directly," Lyra said, forcing the words out, despite the overwhelming sensation still crashing through her senses. "It's reacting. My bloodline carries the same type of magic they tried to artificially recreate here, and my presence within the kingdom, especially the growing bond between us, has been slowly waking whatever remains dormant beneath this chamber. The energy is spreading outward through the earth, affecting wolves and villages connected to old ley lines running beneath the eastern territories." "Can it be stopped?" Damien asked urgently. Lyra closed her eyes, reaching deeper into the strange, instinctive understanding flooding through her. Magic she had spent her entire life suppressing, now finally allowed to fully awaken. "I think," she said slowly, "the only way to stop it is to complete what was left unfinished, not through artificial means, but through a true, natural bond. My mother always said, unstable magic seeks completion. It seeks balance. If our bond remains broken, this energy will continue reacting to the imbalance, spreading further, until it either dissipates naturally over many years, or someone allows a true bond to finally settle the imbalance properly." Every guard in the chamber shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the weight of what she was suggesting. Elder Marcus stepped forward cautiously. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I am certain enough to try," Lyra said, turning to face Damien directly, the ancient symbols around them pulsing steadily brighter, as if responding to the shift in her resolve. "I spent months running from this bond, because I was terrified of what completing it might reveal about me. I understand now that the greater danger was never in accepting it. It was in leaving it broken, allowing fear to cause harm I never intended. Damien searched her face carefully, making certain the choice was entirely her own, free from pressure or urgency. Are you doing this because you believe it is right for the kingdom? He asked quietly. Or because it is right for you? Lyra allowed herself a small, genuine smile, despite the chaos surrounding them. Both, she said simply. For the first time since the coronation, both. With Elder Marcus and the guards watching in respectful silence, Damien took Lyra's hands gently within his own, standing at the center of the ancient stone circle, beneath symbols that had waited decades for this exact moment. The bond that had been forced apart so suddenly, on the night of the coronation, finally began drawing back together, gentle and natural this time, free from fear, free from hesitation. Warmth spread through Lyra's chest as the bond settled fully into place, chasing away weeks of exhaustion and dizziness in an instant, replaced instead by a steady, powerful connection, unlike anything she had ever experienced. She felt Damien's relief mirror her own, his shoulders relaxing as strength flooded back into him, the hollow ache that had plagued him for weeks, finally disappearing entirely. The ancient symbols around them flared once, brilliantly, before slowly dimming into quiet stillness, the dormant energy beneath Hollow Vale finally settling into peaceful balance after decades of restless imbalance. It's done, Lyra whispered, tears of relief slipping down her cheeks as she felt the last remnants of old, dangerous magic finally quiet beneath the earth. Damien pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close, as the weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally began to lift from both of them. It's done, he echoed softly. And it was never a curse, Lyra. It was always simply waiting for the right moment to become whole. But even as relief washed through the chamber, Elder Marcus's expression remained troubled, his eyes fixed on something near the entrance of the ruins that the others had not yet noticed. A lone figure, watching quietly from the shadows, before slipping away unseen, already carrying news back toward the palace that would determine whether the kingdom accepted this newly completed bond, or rose against it entirely. Horns sounded across the palace grounds the moment their traveling party returned, and Lyra knew immediately, from the tense faces of the guards lining the courtyard, that Victor Kane had not wasted the 2 days of their absence. He has gathered support among the border lords, Elder Marcus said grimly as they dismounted, his voice pitched low enough that only Damien and Lyra could hear. Word of the completed bond reached the palace before we did, along with Victor's own version of events, painting it as proof that the king has been manipulated by dangerous magic rather than freely choosing his mate. That is a lie, Lyra said sharply. It is, Marcus agreed, but lies spread quickly when fear is already present, and Victor has spent weeks planting exactly that fear among anyone willing to listen. Damien's expression hardened, the exhaustion of their journey, replaced by sharp, focused resolve. Then we address it directly, tonight, before Victor has the chance to twist the truth any further. The Great Hall was already filling with council members and visiting border lords by the time Damien strode inside, Lyra walking steadily beside him despite the weight of dozens of uncertain, wary stares following their every step. Victor stood near the front of the gathered crowd, his expression carefully arranged into something resembling concern, though satisfaction flickered just beneath the surface. Your Majesty, Victor said smoothly as Damien took his place at the head of the hall, we are relieved to see you return safely. Though I confess, troubling reports have reached us regarding events at Hollow Vale. Then let me address those reports directly, Damien said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. Lyra Ashworth is my true fated mate, bonded not through manipulation or dangerous magic, but through the same natural process every wolf in this kingdom experiences when fate chooses their match. The unstable energy beneath Hollow Vale, remnants of experiments conducted decades ago under my father's rule, was reacting to the imbalance created when our bond was left broken. Completing that bond, freely and willingly, restored balance rather than causing harm. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertainty and curiosity mingling among the assembled lords and council members. With respect, Victor said, stepping forward, how can this council be certain such claims are accurate, rather than convenient explanations offered after the fact? Because I witnessed it myself, Elder Marcus said firmly, stepping forward beside Damien, as did the guards who accompanied our party to Hollow Vale. The energy beneath those ruins responded directly to Lyra's bloodline, and settled entirely once the bond was completed naturally. I have served this council for over 3 decades, and I have never lied to protect a king's decision. I will not begin doing so now. Elder Marcus's steady testimony carried significant weight among the gathered lords, several exchanging uncertain glances as the tide of the room began, slowly, to shift. Sensing his advantage slipping, Victor's composed expression finally cracked slightly. Regardless of the circumstances at Hollow Vale, he said, his voice sharper now, the fact remains that this woman's bloodline was deemed dangerous enough for execution under the previous king's rule. Are we truly meant to simply forget the reasoning behind that decision because the current king has developed personal feelings toward her? The previous king's reasoning was built on fear, not fact, Lyra said, finally stepping forward to speak for herself, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. My mother was executed for magic that heals, not harms. I have spent every day since her death living in fear of the same fate, hiding what I am, suppressing abilities that could have helped countless people over the years, all because this kingdom chose fear over understanding. She paused, meeting the eyes of as many lords and council members as she could, refusing to look away despite years of instinct urging her to hide. I did not choose this bloodline, she continued. I did not choose the magic running through my veins, any more than any wolf in this room chose the particular strength or ability granted to them by birth. What I choose, now, is how I use it, and I choose to use it protecting this kingdom, healing its people, and standing openly beside the king, rather than hiding in fear of what others might think. Silence stretched through the great hall following her words, heavy and uncertain, until a quiet voice broke through from among the gathered border lords. I, for one, have lost 2 members of my household to the illness spreading through the eastern villages, said an older woman near the front of the crowd, her voice trembling slightly, with barely restrained emotion. If this woman's magic played any role in ending that illness, as Elder Marcus claims, then I care very little about old fears rooted in decisions made decades before I was even born. Other voices slowly joined hers, murmurs of cautious support rippling through portions of the crowd, though clear resistance remained among others still swayed by generations of old fear. Victor, sensing the room slipping further from his control, made one final, desperate attempt. Even if her intentions are genuine, he said, the danger of such powerful, unpredictable magic within the royal bloodline cannot simply be dismissed. What happens when future heirs inherit this same magic? Can this council truly guarantee such power will always be used for healing rather than harm? No one can guarantee the future, Damien said firmly, stepping forward once more. Not for magic, not for ordinary strength, not for anything within this kingdom. What I can guarantee is this. I have watched Lyra Ashworth heal strangers who owed her nothing, comfort frightened servants in the middle of the night, and risk her own safety to save an entire kingdom from a danger she did not create. If that is the nature of the power now tied to my bloodline, then I welcome it, and I will not allow fear born from decades-old mistakes to dictate the future of my reign. The hall fell quiet once more, tension hanging thick in the air as Damien's words settled over the gathered crowd. Slowly, deliberately, Elder Marcus stepped forward and knelt before Lyra, an act that sent a visible ripple of shock through the hall. I offer my full support to the king's chosen mate, Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. Not simply as a healer, but as a woman who has proven, time and again, the strength and integrity worthy of standing beside our king. One by one, hesitantly at first, other council members and border lords began following his example, until even those who had remained visibly uncertain moments earlier chose, eventually, to offer their support, rather than stand alone against a tide clearly shifting in Lyra's favor. Victor remained standing near the front of the hall, his expression tight with barely restrained fury, as he watched years of careful planning crumble in the span of a single evening. When Damien finally turned toward him, his expression carried none of the anger Victor perhaps expected, only calm, unwavering authority. Victor, Damien said quietly, though his voice carried easily through the hall, your service to this council has not gone unnoticed over the years, but your recent actions, spreading fear and half-truths rather than seeking honest counsel with your king, cannot continue unaddressed. You will step down from your council position effective immediately, and any further attempts to undermine the stability of this kingdom will be met accordingly. Victor's jaw tightened, though he offered no argument, understanding clearly that the room had turned entirely against him. With a stiff, reluctant bow, he turned and left the great hall in silence, the doors closing heavily behind him. Slowly, the tension within the hall began to ease, replaced by a cautious, growing sense of relief among the gathered crowd. Damien turned to Lyra, taking her hand gently within his own, and for the first time since the night of the coronation, she felt no fear at all standing beside him in front of so many watching eyes. "You did that," Damien said softly, admiration clear in his voice. "Not me. You stood in front of an entire kingdom and refused to hide any longer." "We did it together," Lyra corrected gently, squeezing his hand. "I could not have found the courage alone." Over the following weeks, word of the completed bond and the truth behind Hollow Vale spread steadily throughout the kingdom, and slowly, carefully, the fear that had once surrounded Lyra's bloodline began transforming into something closer to respect. Healers from her mother's old lineage, long forced into hiding out of fear, began quietly reaching out, grateful for a kingdom finally willing to see their gifts as something other than a curse. The illness spreading through the eastern villages faded steadily, as the energy beneath Hollow Vale settled fully into peaceful balance, and reports of recovery reached the palace daily, each one easing a little more of the guilt Lyra had carried since first learning her presence had unknowingly contributed to the crisis. On a quiet evening several weeks later, Damien found Lyra standing on the same balcony where he had once stared out at the dark fields, searching desperately for the woman who had fled from him on the night of his coronation. This time, she stood beside him willingly, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of gold and amber, colors that matched, quite fittingly, the exact shade of his eyes. "Do you regret any of it?" Damien asked quietly, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. "The running, the fear, everything that led us here?" Lyra considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret the pain it caused you," she said honestly. "But I do not regret becoming someone strong enough to eventually stand beside you openly, rather than someone who accepted a bond out of duty before she was ready to accept it fully within her own heart." Damien smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "everything happened exactly as it needed to." Below them, the kingdom of Veremore settled quietly into evening, its people slowly beginning to understand that the healer once feared for the blood running through her veins had become, in the end, one of the strongest protectors their kingdom had ever known. Snow had begun falling softly over Veremore by the time the formal coronation ceremony was announced, and this time, when Lyra walked toward the fire pit at the center of the stone courtyard, she did not tremble, and she did not run. The entire kingdom had gathered once more, filling the courtyard and spilling out into the surrounding fields, far more people than had attended the first ceremony months earlier. Word of the healer who had saved the eastern villages, who had faced an entire council without flinching, who had chosen love and courage over fear, had spread throughout every corner of the kingdom, and curiosity had drawn even the most distant border families to witness the moment for themselves. Ivy stood near the front of the crowd, tears of pride shining in her eyes, as she watched her niece approach the fire pit with steady, confident steps. Elder Marcus stood at Damien's side, his expression carrying quiet satisfaction at having played a small part in guiding the kingdom toward this moment. Even several healers from distant villages, families who had spent years hiding their own inherited gifts out of fear, had traveled to witness a ceremony they never imagined their kingdom would openly celebrate. Damien waited at the fire pit exactly as he had months earlier, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. There was no uncertainty in his expression, no anxious tension rippling through the crowd, only quiet, steady anticipation for a moment they both had fought so hard to reach. "Lyra Ashworth," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "Do you accept this bond, freely, fully, and without fear, standing before your kingdom as my equal and my mate?" "I do," Lyra said, her voice steady and sure, carrying easily across the gathered crowd. "Freely, fully, and without fear." The crowd erupted into cheers as Damien took her hands, the golden firelight dancing across both their faces as the formal bonding ceremony continued, sealing publicly what had already been true in their hearts for weeks. When the ceremony concluded, Elder Marcus stepped forward to present Lyra with a simple silver circlet, marking her official position as Queen of Veremore, a title she accepted with quiet grace, rather than the anxious uncertainty that had once defined her every interaction with palace life. In the months that followed, Lyra used her new position to establish something the kingdom had never before possessed: a proper healing academy, welcoming wolves and healers from bloodlines once feared and hidden, offering training and protection to gifts that had spent generations forced into secrecy. Families who once lived in constant fear of discovery began, slowly, cautiously, stepping forward, grateful for a kingdom finally willing to see their abilities as valuable rather than dangerous. Damien, meanwhile, worked steadily to rebuild trust among border lords still hesitant about the changes sweeping through the kingdom, traveling personally to distant villages to address concerns directly rather than allowing rumors and old fears to spread unchecked. Together, they built a partnership stronger than either had imagined possible on the night Lyra first fled from the coronation grounds, each supporting the other through challenges neither could have faced alone. Victor Kane, stripped of his council position, retreated to his family estates in the Northern Territories, and though occasional whispers suggested he continued nursing resentment over his fall from power, he made no further attempts to challenge the growing stability of Damien's reign. Some among the palace staff speculated that watching an entire kingdom embrace what he had spent years fearing had, quietly, humbled him more than any punishment ever could. 1 year after the formal coronation, Lyra stood once again on the palace balcony overlooking the fields where she had once fled in terror, watching healers and villagers move freely through the academy grounds below, their laughter and quiet conversation carrying up on the evening breeze. Damien joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently against her shoulder. "You built something remarkable," he murmured, watching the same scene with quiet pride. "We built it," Lyra corrected softly, leaning back against him. "None of this would exist if you hadn't chosen to understand, instead of simply demanding answers. And none of it would exist if you hadn't found the courage to finally stop running," Damien replied. Lyra smiled, watching the last light of sunset fade gently into evening stars. She thought, briefly, of her mother, of the gentle woman who had spent her final years teaching healing songs at their kitchen table, never living to see a kingdom finally ready to accept the gift she had carried her entire life. The grief still lingered, quiet and familiar, but alongside it now sat something her younger self had never dared imagine possible: peace. "She would be proud," Damien said softly, seeming to sense exactly where her thoughts had wandered. "I hope so," Lyra whispered. Below them, snow began falling gently once more, dusting the academy rooftops and quiet garden paths in soft white, a peaceful contrast to the storm that had once threatened to tear the kingdom apart entirely. Wolves who once hid their true nature out of fear now walked openly among ordinary villagers, sharing knowledge and healing skills passed down through bloodlines, finally free from the shadow of old executions and buried secrets. Word of Veremore's transformation spread gradually beyond its own borders, drawing curious visitors from neighboring territories, eager to understand how a kingdom once ruled by fear had become a place of genuine understanding and cooperation. Several neighboring rulers sent formal requests for guidance, hoping to establish similar academies within their own lands, and Lyra found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, traveling occasionally beyond Veremore's borders to offer counsel and training to healers, desperate for the same acceptance her own kingdom had finally learned to offer. Through it all, the bond between Lyra and Damien only grew stronger, tested repeatedly by the ordinary challenges of ruling a kingdom, yet never again threatened by the fear and secrecy that had once nearly torn them apart before they had even properly begun. They faced disagreements, as any true partnership eventually does, disputes over policy, occasional frustration, when stubbornness on both sides clashed. But always, beneath every disagreement, remained the steady, unshakable foundation, built during those difficult early months, when trust had to be earned, rather than simply assumed. Late one spring evening, nearly 2 years after the night Lyra first rejected him in front of the entire kingdom, Damien found her in the academy gardens, kneeling beside a young girl no older than 7, gently guiding the child's trembling hands as she attempted, for the first time, to consciously call forth the healing warmth, flickering faintly beneath her skin. The girl's parents stood nearby, watching with a mixture of nervous hope and quiet wonder, clearly still adjusting to a world where their daughter's unusual gift was met with careful guidance, rather than fearful whispers. "There," Lyra said softly, smiling warmly, as a faint golden glow finally settled steadily around the girl's small hands. "You see, it was never something to be afraid of. It was simply waiting for you to be ready." The girl's face broke into a delighted, disbelieving smile, and her parents' quiet gratitude needed no words at all. Watching from a short distance away, Damien felt something settle warmly in his chest, a quiet certainty that every difficult choice, every frightening risk, every moment of doubt along the way had led, eventually, to exactly the life he had once only dared to hope for on the night his wolf first recognized its fated mate, across a crowded, uncertain courtyard. Lyra glanced up and caught his eye, offering a small, private smile meant only for him, before turning her attention back to the little girl still marveling at her own newfound gift. Veremore had changed, slowly and steadily, from a kingdom shaped by fear into one shaped by understanding, and at its center stood a king and queen who had learned, together, that the greatest strength never came from hiding what made them different, but from finally choosing, bravely and completely, to stand in the light of who they truly were. And as the golden evening settled softly over the Academy gardens, the echoes of an old, painful history finally gave way entirely to something new, something lasting, something built not on fear, but on the quiet, unshakable power of truth freely spoken and love freely chosen.